Welcome everyone to my vlog number 1 for SAC 7108 Skills versus Capacities in the Weight Room. The athletes that I have filmed for this vlog were not comfortable entering the gym due to the current COVID-19 situation, and therefore I decided to film the videos at the comfort of my athletes' homes. This created some issues, such as having to film in portrait mode for some videos, just because the frame of the video would not fit in landscape mode and my athlete and the issues in the videos would not show well. Skill issues when performing a movement can be a result of motor control issues, knowledge and familiarity with the movement's technical model, and not previously learning the movement because of a previous capacity issue. On the other hand, a capacity issue can be defined as an athlete not having the sufficient ability to produce enough force to perform the movement or a lack of mobility and flexibility to perform the movement according to the technical model. So athlete A for this vlog is a local female handball player. So she is defined to be part of the athletic population and has novice experience with weight training in the weight room. Here we can observe athlete A squatting from the sagittal plane. We can immediately see an anterior pelvic tilt and a bit of a hyperextension at the lower back. As the athlete squats down, we can see how the extension of the back is maintained and increased, and the athlete just barely gets to parallel at the bottom position of the squat. So if we keep the video paused here and mark the angles at the hip and the knees, we can see that they are at 56 degrees and 88 degrees respectively. Glassbrook found that with light loads, hip flexion should be at 87 degrees and knee flexion at 85 degrees in a high bar squat as used by the athlete. Here we can see that athlete A uses a more hip flexion dominant strategy as used in the low bar squat, where a hip flexion angle should be at around 42 degrees. From the rear view, we can see that the athlete grips the bar closer with her left hand than her right hand. We can also see that both feet are quite pronated inwards, and this indicates that the athlete is in fact flat-footed. If you look closely inside the blue circles where the feet are, you can see that as the athlete squats down, her feet rotate inwards in a pronated position. As you can see over here again, the feet rotate in. Here was then perform a hip flexion test. With this test, I found out that there was less mobility in the left hip than the right hip. It can be clearly seen at the point where the knee goes beyond the left hip in this test, and you can see the left hip rotate outwards, indicating a lack of mobility. So after evaluating hip mobility and flexion, I proceeded to performing an ankle flexion test, and we can see that in both ankles, flexion is very limited as the heel rises off the floor just before the knee touches the wall, and we can see that the toes are actually touching the wall. Therefore, the athlete has an issue with bringing the knee over the toes. Thus, from the observations made, I have concluded that this athlete has capacity issues with the squat, mainly due to lack of hip mobility in the left side and lack of mobility in the ankles. Moving forward, the aim is to work on ankle and hip mobility drills to improve the squat form and getting her to work to the full range of motion. Athlete A is now performing the overhead press. From the sagittal view, we can immediately observe that there is an anterior pelvic tilt as observed with the squat, and that the athlete does not brace her core and tighten her glutes to stay upright. As the athlete pushes the bar up, we can observe how the athlete excessively hyperextends her spine and pushes herself forward to get the bar over the midline of her body. We can also note how her ribs rise up and out with the yellow circle, indicating a lack of bracing before starting the lift. Her spine is placed into an excessive lumbar lordotic curve. When I asked the athlete about the use of this technique, she explained how she thought that this was the right technique to use in the overhead press. From the frontal plane, we can now observe how the bar is not horizontally aligned equally on both sides. Even as we pause the video in the middle of the movement, we can observe that this misalignment is maintained throughout the whole movement. What I then did with this athlete was perform a shoulder flexion test to identify if the previously mentioned issues were happening through a lack of scapular mobility. The athlete managed to get to an angle of 171 degrees, which is close to the ideal 180 degrees as written by McKean and Burkitt. I then cued the athlete to brace her core, tighten her glutes, and keep her spine in a neutral position. We can now see that she has the sufficient overhead mobility to get the bar over her head without hyperextending her lower back. I have concluded that for the overhead press, this athlete lacked the skill because of not bracing her core and having an unleveled bar in the starting position. Moving forward, the aim is to further work on shoulder flexion mobility and identify the cause of the present anterior pelvic tilt in both the squat and the overhead press. Athlete B is a middle-aged woman who does walking as her main form of physical activity and has little to no experience with strength training. Here, Athlete B is performing the squat, and what we can immediately observe is that the movement is initiated at the knees instead of the hips. When the video is paused at the bottom of the squat, we can see how there is little to no hip flexion occurring as the knees travel over the toes before reaching parallel. As a result, the athlete cannot get beyond the quarter to half squat position. In the frontal plane, we can see how the athlete does not grip the bar firmly with her palms, but manages to grip it equally from both sides. This wide grip indicates a lack of scapular retraction. We can also observe how her feet are pointing outwards. Proceeded to testing the athlete for ankle flexion, and she passed this test as she managed to touch the wall by keeping her heels on the floor. After that, I tested the athlete for hip flexion and mobility, which she passed by managing to comfortably get her knee past her hip. Using these tests and concluding that the athlete has the adequate hip and ankle mobility to perform the squat with better form, I then taught the athlete how to initiate the movement at the hip using a simple chair. During this movement, I cued her to sit back and tap the chair with her glutes. Now see athlete B performing the squat again from the sagittal plane, and we can observe that the movement pattern is much closer to the technical model, even though at the bottommost position of her squat, she does not manage to get below parallel and there is an excessive lordotic curve at the spine. Even though there are still some restrictions in the way the movement is performed, I have concluded that athlete B had a skill issue with the squat because of the lack of knowledge about how the movement should be performed and lack of weight training experience. And now view athlete B performing the overhead press from the sagittal plane, and we can see that in the starting position, the elbows are held posterior to the wrist. The bar then travels anteriorly, and the end position of the bar is anterior to the midline of the body. Then proceeded to analyze if this movement pattern is also happening when the athlete is seated. I instructed the athlete to keep her back against the back of the chair, and as the athlete B pressed the bar vertically up, I identified a similar movement pattern as observed in the standing overhead press. Based on these observations, I moved on to performing a shoulder flexion test. If we keep our eyes in the green circle, we can observe that the athlete is unable to flex her deltoids without extending her spine all the way up to the point at which her arms reach 180 degrees. As a result, I then proceeded to have the athlete perform some myofascial release exercises using a ball against the wall and some latissimus dorsi stretches using a band to increase mobility. After these exercises were performed, I had the athlete perform the seated overhead press again, and we can observe that she does manage to get the bar closer to the midline of her body, however, fails to keep her scapula retracted whilst pressing the bar up. In summary, athlete B does not have the sufficient scapular mobility to perform the overhead press according to the technical model, and thus is defined as having a capacity issue with performing the overhead press. Moving forward, the aim is to continue performing the myofascial release and stretches for the latissimus dorsi together with corrective exercises for the overhead press. In summary, athlete A had a capacity issue with the squat because of a lack of ankle mobility and decreased hip mobility on the left side. Moving forward, until these issues are resolved, the athlete will use solely unilateral squat-based movements to get the joints to work to their full range of motion. With the overhead press, athlete A had a skill issue because of a lack of knowledge on how the movement should be performed, and a lack of knowledge on how to brace her core appropriately. The use of this movement in training will be continued, but the cause of the anterior pelvic tilt will be identified and tackled together with a continued effort to obtain 180 degrees of shoulder flexion. Athlete B had mainly a skill issue with the squat due to a lack of experience and lack of knowledge about the squat's technical model. The aim now is to continue learning the right technique and use variations of the squat to get below the parallel position whilst maintaining a neutral spine, together with continuous work on hip and spinal mobility. The athlete had a capacity issue with the overhead press as she lacks the adequate scapular mobility to get the bar over the midline of her body in the overhead position. In the starting position, she is also unable to get her elbows underneath her wrists before initiating the movement, as can be seen with the anterior bar putt. The aim is to use unilateral dumbbell exercises when pressing overhead and continue working to increase scapular mobility and decrease latissimus dorsi tightness.